or
Very.
coming up on 3 years now. Um, Prior to AMA, I spent about 10 years in Silicon Valley. I also spent 13 years at Nissan. I've done connected services. I've done the technical side of the house, strategy, and I've done product, kind of the range at both Nissan and at SiriusXM and other tier one providers. And I'm really excited to talk about HMI in an autonomous world today.
Super. Thank you, Chip. And Cap Shaw, introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Cap Shah, Principal Consultant at Automobility Advisors. So prior to Automobility Advisors, I've been all around the auto industry in functions anywhere from business development and client strategy to business intelligence and data analytics. At such companies such as Audi of America, Edmunds, TrueCar, JD Power, and a host of other startups in the fintech and automotive space.
Great. Thanks. And we have special guest Jamal Berkeley with us today. Jamal.
Good morning. Jamal Berkeley. I've been in autonomous robotics designing human-machine interfaces through ocean-faring sea drones, through robo-taxis, class 6 middle-mile logistics trucking, and now with an OEM doing ADAS and autonomy features in an OEM.
Wow.
Pleasure to be
Great.
here. Looking forward to talking with everyone.
Thank you. Thank you. So we should have a good conversation about this topic and really interesting. Before we begin, I was just thinking about, as we were kind of getting ready for this, my experience with HMI. And of course, it's changed over the years, right? It's like some of you, I started out in the automotive business with older cars than we have now. They didn't have anything like what the HMI is today. And in fact, before that, I started as a dairy farmer's son on tractors, right? So the tractors I got to drive had steering wheels and throttles and the hand throttles and two brakes because you had to be able to control the right side and the left side, right? And I was poking around a little bit on the web just to see what does tractor HMI look like now. And this is the kind of thing that I came up with. You can see that. Here's a John Deere interior, right? So you have kind of the pistol grip control with all kinds of things that you can do, and the screen and all the different knobs and buttons and things like that. So, in that world, HMI's come a long way. And of course, cars and trucks have come a long way. Even motorcycles have new HMI. There's dashboards and screens on motorcycles now, which is really interesting. So why don't we talk a little bit about what we kind of encompass as HMI? When we say HMI in the automotive context, what do we mean? What are we talking about? And with that, maybe I'll start with Jamal. Just tell us a little bit about what you think HMI really encompasses. What's the area of operation, let's say?
Yeah, I think it encompasses everything from the hardware and the holistic experience that someone interacts with that vehicle or that piece of hardware, whether you're talking tractors or cars or anything in between. I think as we start to get moving more towards higher levels of autonomy, so level 3 and level 4, especially in the automobile industry, there is a pivot going on as the human in the loop is required to have less and less interaction. And so that time on safety critical and safety relevant sort of interactions to monitor the system is now pivoting towards the autonomy taking those things on. What are we doing with those types of interactions? And that's where I think a lot of smartphones are coming into play, right? How do we use that as a hub to expand these other interactions and focus time on the kinds of tasks that might be tangential or adjacent or not even relevant to the operations of the device in the vehicle.
Right. Chip, anything to elaborate on HMI?
Yeah, I think what's interesting in how HMI is developing is we sort of have traditional ideas, just like you're talking with the tractors, of HMI just being the human giving input to the vehicle on what to do. You might get some basic output back, what speed you're traveling, RPMs, and that sort of thing. But as we've evolved, you now have both active and passive inputs and outputs. So in addition to telling the vehicle things and getting some information back, systems like driver monitoring systems can passively collect information about the person that's driving. And that feeds in, especially as we get talking about the migration to autonomous vehicles. So it's a much more involved, and there are a lot of more options and opportunities in HMI than there used to be.
Yeah. So, and Cap, anything else from your point of view to elaborate on? I know that you also have done a lot of work kind of looking at different vehicles and vehicle types over the years.
Oh yeah,
So,
absolutely. And to add to some of the dimensions that Jamal and Chip have already shared, there's also the aspect of, HMI really kind of breaks down on two other dimensions as well. It's the driving and driver involvement, and then there's the infotainment, right? So it's almost like pejoratively you could call that the driver distraction dimension, right? But there's some things that are trying to help you to drive or keep you driving. And then there's the other things, like your speedometer or something like that might also qualify, right, at a basic level. Then there's other things to keep you entertained, right? Your radio as it used to be, and now it's your whole infotainment screen.
yeah. So let's kind of talk about the current state of HMI in automotive. What are maybe some of the things that you've seen that are really innovative, really interesting, some things that are still vestigial, hanging around from the past that haven't been, ditched yet? Give me some ideas of the kinds of things that you think are good and maybe not so good in the automotive space.
Yeah, sure.
Let's
So
start with Cap.
Oh yes, sorry, jumping right in here. The thing about HMI is that, as you said, it's really evolved, right? It's not like it just came out of nowhere. It's been a constantly evolving landscape, and frankly, things that we didn't use, today we wouldn't necessarily consider them HMI back then, but at one point, the state of the art was the Pioneer one DIN head unit with the Dolphins, right? It was just interactive. It was cool, right? And in some ways, while that wasn't really the forebearer per se of the infotainment screen in vehicle, that sort of kickstarted that type of idea, right? Having that screen, having a backup camera, having all of the functions that you have a whole color screen sitting in the car. That's really been an arc that started probably in the late 90s, but it's really morphed. And really, what's taken us into the current era has really been the advent of the touchscreen in the vehicle, right? Before that, you sometimes had some control knobs and other ways of going through the menus, interacting with the radio, whatever it was. Sometimes some even driver functions of the vehicle. But with the touchscreen, it's really supercharged the ability for a driver to interact with all the different functions and infotainment of the vehicle. And then, of course, that also begetted things like smartphone integration. But that anyway, the touchscreen has really been probably the most monumental change in the current era. Where we're going next is a different story, but where we've got to where we are, it's really been the touchscreen. But in addition to that, there's been a couple other things, and some of them are actually have been around a lot longer than we give them credit for, like the heads-up display, right?
Mhm.
Where we're going, we're going to have other technologies that also project forward, and we'll talk about those a little bit later here. But the heads-up display has really been the forebearer of projecting information in your line of sight, right, in a virtual type of manner. And that obviously opens the door for other things. But it started off as vehicle speed, right? That started in the late 80s. Probably the most popular vehicle or famous vehicle for popularizing heads-up display is the Corvette, right? But it started with vehicle speed, and now there's all types of things you might have, which radio station you're on or whatever, your navigation directions, all types of different pieces of information, but it just keeps your eyes on the road. It keeps you involved as a driver.
Yeah. Chip, anything to add in terms of current state of HMI?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. One of the phrases that Kat brought up is driver distraction. And as we shift into autonomous, there's going to be more discussion around whether an interface is distracting or it is involving, right? And you may have the ability to be distracted from your driving and get more immersed in an entertainment experience than you would be if you're having to drive, of course. And you mentioned both heads-up displays and touch screens, and those can have very opposite effects on driver distraction, right? The whole concept, as you mentioned, for the heads-up display is to be in line of sight, you can stay focused. A touch screen, one of the challenges with a touch screen is without the tactile feedback, it can be more difficult to interact without taking your attention and putting it into the touch screen, as opposed to knobs and switches and levers that folks can get comfortable with using eyes off. So that shift in interface style is going to get sort of papered over a little bit by the fact that we shift to autonomous and you can begin to take your attention off and use something like a touchscreen to its full extent.
Yeah, yeah. Jamal, anything to add about the current state of HMI?
Yeah, I think I would add there's also a movement towards being able to think about this experience across all these displays and touch screens more holistically. And so, depending on the level of autonomy, ranging from 2 to 4 or 5, the interaction with the driver is changing, but also your interaction, the state, the transitions when you're moving in and out of autonomy modes, when you're in the lower levels of a level 2 autonomy and even level 3, right? Cars have different ODDs. And so people are really focusing on the transitions as you're moving in and out of those states. And then how are you expressing that and interacting with across all of these screens and getting to that distraction touch screens, what device you're on, what device you're looking at it. There's also a monitoring system, DMS system, so monitoring the driver's eyes to measure distraction. And so as you move up to different levels of autonomy and needing engagement, being able to signal whatever display the driver may be looking at that they need to maybe pay more attention to the road. All of those kinds of things are just being explored uniquely across all the manufacturers.
Yeah.
And depending on your system, what the strengths and weaknesses of your autonomy system is, you need to custom tailor those transitions and those experiences to have a holistic experience and story arc.
Got it. So, Jamal, to stick with you for a minute, there was maybe some specific comments you made earlier about smartphone integration and that kind of thing. Everyone has a personal device, touchscreen in their pocket that they're using all the time. It has all their information. They get in the car, they'll want these things to be kind of interacting and be seamless, right? And so things like CarPlay and Android Auto have been invented to help do that. But what are the other issues, or what are any of the issues around this idea that people have their own kind of, in their hand HMI, and then they also are in a vehicle? And how do those things work together? And what are the kind of forces at work there?
Yeah. On the very tactical level, that device can be distracting. It's the hub of sort of their interaction experience from outside the vehicle, right? And so the vehicle is part of that larger narrative of that experience that you want to engage with. And so what are the ways that are appropriate? Lower levels of autonomy, you generally, OEMs tend to want to sort of gate the interaction with the system so that the phone is sort of self-contained and that interaction and those experiences are on certain devices and not engaged with the car. As you're increasing the levels of autonomy, you're starting to see that stuff again still separated, but start to take over more of those displays as that pivot and the car takes on more of those responsibilities. And it's really seen as the hub by which whatever content that person is interested in, whatever activities they may want to continue from prior to their experience in the vehicle. This is the throughput that enables that continuity in those experiences. And so now the question is, how do we explore the expansion and that continuity of that experience into all of the different devices and displays that are in the car? And you can see that with a lot of the prototyping where like everybody's using all of the displays across the entire dashboard as being screens, right? And that seems to be ever expanding, going into doors, the entire vehicle's becoming part of that engagement with those devices.
And therefore, right, the entire occupancy of the vehicle. So it's not just the driver, it's passengers front, passengers rear, who could all be doing different things, right, at the same time.
And I think there's an exploring of whether that's grouped together or individuals or combinations thereof. Agreed.
Right. Cap or Chip, any other comments on smartphone integration in particular and the challenges there?
Yeah, if I look at smartphones from an auto manufacturer perspective, there's a couple of challenges and a couple of benefits that you can see in smartphones, right? On the challenge side, you've got that driver distraction concept, right? So the vehicle HMI in a non-autonomous world, you're supposed to be focused on driving, and the HMI should be intuitive to use and not distracting, right? It should be easy, shouldn't take a lot of your engagement. Whereas a smartphone is exactly the opposite. It's designed for immersive engagement, right? You get pulled into the world of the smartphone. So people using smartphones in vehicles can be quite dangerous in a non-autonomous world that you get distracted from the road. We've all seen the person driving down the highway like this and can't stay in their lane, right? Another challenge that isn't addressed by an autonomous world is the challenge of control of the brand experience and the interaction with the customer, right? So the OEMs are losing differentiation and branding by having the HMI experience controlled by a third party, an outside company, a Google and Apple. So that isn't really helped by autonomous. On the other hand, you do have the advantages. So as Jamal said, it's the center of your life outside your vehicle, and you get to bring that experience into your vehicle, your identities, your interactions, your accounts. And that's something that can be a real advantage to integrating your vehicle with the rest of your life. And the customizability of having everybody with their own device and their own interaction is really nice. So as we move into an autonomous world, that distraction aspect can be ameliorated because you can allow much more involved use of your broad-end devices when you don't have to pay so much attention to the road. But there are still the challenges of that brand experience in the vehicle, of that interaction with the customer being sort of outsourced to a third-party company.
Yeah, got it. Cap, anything else to add?
Yeah, just that, to add on to what Chip said, smartphones were inevitable, and that smartphone integration just allowed the automaker to still sort of have some sort of measure control. So Chip is absolutely right that to some degree, automakers have to give up control of how, what functions are on that screen and how people interact with it. But to some degree, it was almost, I don't want to say a move of desperation, but that's where things were going, right? If you don't want people touching their phone while they're in the car, that's really the only way to ensure that you have them using it through the vehicle.
Great. So there's another, dimension of what's been happening lately in the connected vehicle space in particular, called over-the-air updates, OTA we like to call it, which is sending data to the vehicle and changing the vehicle in some way, right? And there's lots of ways to do that, and every automaker does it to some extent now. How does that affect HMI itself? How does that change things for HMI, for the customer, better, worse? How's that working out? Why don't we start with Chip?
Yeah, and this OTA software updates are really a lesson learned by OEMs from smartphones and devices.
Mhm.
So we've all gotten accustomed to the fact that when we buy one of these things, I'm sorry, there you go. When we buy one of these things, it's a blank canvas, right? It's a starting point. This device is going to be completely customizable, personalizable, and it's going to evolve and improve over time. I'll get new features, I'll get new capabilities, I'll add applications. I can customize my interface with a phone, and cars are becoming more and more like that. You can not have your vehicle be its very best on the day that you bought it, right? And from then on, it's just wearing out. You can continue to add new capabilities, new features. You can customize your environment. You can integrate with other components. You'll be able to do things in 5 years with a car you have now that you don't even think are going to be possible right now. And that extends the life of the vehicle, and that allows over time improvement and more sophistication and configuration around the customer's needs. So as autonomous level 3 or level 4 or level 5 comes into the picture, those can be retrofit, and features can be retrofit into vehicles, and the HMI adjusted appropriately for those particular environments. So it extends the life, and it improves what we're able to expect out of our vehicles, not only today, but tomorrow with the same car.
Yep. Yep. Jamal, any other comments about that topic of OTA?
Yeah, I think Chip brings up a good point, which is vehicles are more and more becoming about software and as far as how they're driven, how they operate, and less about the hardware, right? And so the ability to keep evolving based on modern software development, not just smartphones, but all of our applications are doing this, right? They're constantly being updated and adjusted and modified and improved. And cars are going the same way. They're no different. They're seeing that. I think, there are lots of concerns. The timelines and horizons are more like enterprise software. You want to be very cautious because of the safety factors that are involved. But Tesla is a good example of constantly updating and revising the software on their vehicles, right? And their autonomy as a key portion of that.
Yeah. Yeah. Cap, anything to add?
Yeah, also with OTA, one of the key uh, you know areas where it's really important is in terms of keeping a recurring revenue, right? So in terms of subscription and things like that, right? They can make features optional that are available via OTA. Maybe features you don't necessarily need, but hey, you can pay extra for it. Tesla, for example, even just like cloud storage for your driver recording data, right? For like the vehicle cameras, right? So things like that can help add that recurring revenue while making, as Chip said, the life of the vehicle extended out. How many times have we heard family and friends tell us that they want to get a new vehicle because they want some new features that they don't have in their current vehicle, right? So if you extend the life of a current vehicle, then there's less of that chance they're going to switch to a competitor vehicle. They'll stay with your vehicle, but then they'll add recurring revenue, right? So you may be, to some degree, extending the life of the vehicle means that they may not get into new one of your vehicles, but better than them getting into a competitor vehicle.
Yeah, I think automakers are trying to figure that out, right? So many years ago, we would say they had a planned obsolescence strategy, right? They wanted it to not be so compelling sooner so that you bought another vehicle and upgraded. And now if we think about planned life cycle management, the opposite might be the case. They want it to be extended as long as possible. But to me, that begs the question that they have to then become services companies, not just manufacturing products companies, right? Because they're selling services once that product goes out the door after
There's
that. So
there's also a benefit to that, right? You're also, because you're software based, you can also be capturing a lot more data and insight into your
mhm,
customers that you may, and have opportunities for that you may not have in a hardware focused
that's right.
world.
That's right. How they use the vehicle itself and
Hmm.
improvements you can make. Sure. That's great. So we have a really good audience question I think is timely for this area we're talking about. Mike Novak asks, what's the state of voice controls in cars? Are we finally there, right? We've been talking about voice controls forever. And they are, Alexa's been in cars and things like that. When I was at IBM some years ago, we had a Watson voice assistant that even was used in a small low-speed vehicle called Ollie. So that was the control mechanism, was the voice. Any comments about voice controls and where things are? Chip, why don't we start with you?
I think we are really approaching an inflection point there. There have been voice controls in vehicles for a long time, but they've been very restricted, and you really had to learn a dictionary, right? You have to learn exactly how to use voice controls in a vehicle. It could be really awkward. So, if any of you ever tried to put a destination in by voice in one of the early vehicles that could do this, the process is many steps, and it's quite awkward, and you have to go through a really long exchange. And I know I've seen folks using it for the first time that are having arguments with their cars, which is not where you want to be because no, I said this. That's not what I meant. As LLMs have gained in capability and you're seeing more integration of that, the ability to interact by voice is becoming a lot more natural. And I think that is what's going to enable it to be a much more effective piece of in-vehicle HMI. You don't have to go through a rigorous, ordered, certain vocabulary, string of commands to get a vehicle to do a thing. You can just go, oh, hey, I want to go to the closest McDonald's, and off you go. Right. So I think we are reaching the point where that technology is capable of providing that sort of an experience, and people are becoming more comfortable with it, having their Alexa or their Google device in their home, in their phone. You've gone from hey Siri to hey whatever device, or
Mhm.
whichever LLM you like, and the ability to have a conversation with that is something that people are more accustomed to, so they're going to expect that out of their vehicles and be comfortable with that in their vehicles.
Yeah, great. Jamal, what do you see regarding voice?
Yeah, I think I see a bifurcation. I think a lot of what Chip's talking about are sort of non-critical features that the voice control is controlling. So things like
Mhm.
entertainment and things that are not critical to the car function. There's so much regulation around the critical functions that I think it's very hard to see OEMs taking that risk and exploring against some of those regulations and getting some of that stuff changed. So that's an area I think where you'll see it, to Chip's point, really focused on controlling things that are non-essential for control and safety of the
Yeah,
vehicle, and probably not moving too much into that side because of the very strict regulations, and they sort of vary by region too. So a lot of OEMs try to sort of standardize across all of them as well. And so if you've got one that's very restrictive, that may prevent them from investing in the
yeah,
critical,
yeah, that's a
safety
really good
critical
point.
side of it.
Really good point. Cap, anything else in your mind regarding voice controls?
Yeah, just to add that, voice controls were one solution, and they will continue to be an important solution. But there's been efforts to try other things, like for example, when BMW tried the gesture control, which
Mhm.
they're now phasing out. But it's all just an effort of it's all in service of trying to allow you to continue driving and operating the vehicle, but then also control these other functions that you're, whether it's your climate control, your radio, or navigation, or something else, right? It's trying to do that while focused on driving. That's obviously going to start changing in the future as we move into autonomous driving, but obviously voice interactions are not being displaced. They are going to continue on. And as Chip and Jamal said, with the ability to be able to speak natural language and have it pick up what you want to do, it's a marked difference from where it used to be, as Chip said, where you had to understand how the system needs you to input it, and you have to do layer 1, layer 2, layer 3 to get it to do something that, it feels intuitively simple otherwise.
Yeah. All right. Great. Super conversation. This is going to be now the audience participation part. I have a small little poll I want to share and just see what everybody says, because now we're going to move into the autonomous topic a little bit more, right? So we've talked about HMI generally, but let me launch this. This is just 3 questions. I'll give everybody about a minute to answer them. Should be pretty simple. Love to see how this works out and see what everybody says. So take your time. All right, we got about 18 answers so far. I'll get in there. We'll give it another 10 seconds. All right. 20. Very good. So let's share the results. It looks like some people have been distracted and a few people have not been distracted. That's pretty amazing. Good job. Many people have driven a vehicle with Super Cruise or full self-driving. Not everybody. And then many more people than I would have thought have ridden an autonomous car. So our audience has maybe a lot more of experience with these kinds of vehicles. So let's talk about the autonomous experience. HMI has been put in the cars for a while to try and allow the driver to drive the car, but also have all these other features, passengers to interact with the vehicle. In the autonomous world, especially as we start to move to autonomous where there isn't even a steering wheel, it's a whole different animal, right? But I see there's a transition point right now where there's HMI that's almost being readied for an autonomous future, right? So automakers are putting certain things in, knowing that at some point the person isn't going to be driving the car necessarily, and they can essentially enhance it without a lot of effort because they already started to do that. So let's talk about that kind of generally. Cap, in your survey of the industry, all the different types of vehicles you look at, are you seeing that kind of thing? Are you seeing those kinds of things put in vehicles now that will be ready for HMI later, or sorry, for autonomous later?
Oh yeah, absolutely, George. I mean, there's so many technologies that at times can feel silly right now in the current world we're in, but it's important to look at them again in the landscape of autonomous in the future, right? And I'll give you a couple examples. So obviously, we all know that Tesla has been at the forefront of having a lot of in-vehicle functionality that just seems antithetical to driving, right? Like being able to watch Netflix or YouTube or play games, right? They have a whole series of games that you can play interacting with the vehicle controls itself in order to operate those games. And it seems like, okay, I guess for the times that I'm supercharging for 40 minutes at a time, it gives me something to do. Sure, I could do it through my phone, but yeah, it's great, okay, that I can do it through the vehicle. So it kind of seems like, okay, that's cool, but it's just kind of rise the level of nifty, but whatever. But when you think about it, having all of that integrated into the vehicle, once you are in an era where, as the driver or the passenger, whoever's in the front seat, wherever in the back seat as well, if the whole concept of having to be in charge of operating the vehicle isn't there, if you can just act as a passenger even from the driver's seat, then sure, yeah, why wouldn't you be able to watch YouTube or Netflix or play video games, right? So having that sort of technology in place, obviously you have safety mechanisms where it disallows it while you're operating the vehicle, while the vehicle's in motion. But once you can legally allow the vehicle to take command of the vehicle driving, then why wouldn't you make that available, right? In that same vein, there's also a couple other technologies out there. I mean, Mercedes-Benz is right now still in the process of launching Teams integration, right? And that's probably going to be first of many different integrations across different manufacturers and across, not just Teams, but probably Zoom, Slack, whatever, Google Meets, so any type of meeting software that can then utilize the in-vehicle cameras and the in-vehicle displays. Now, Mercedes-Benz, again, just like the Tesla example, is putting in the important safeguards to ensure that, okay, so they can see you, but you don't get to see the whole meeting while you're driving for obvious reasons, right? All of those things can change. So once you no longer need to be the one operating the vehicle's operating itself in an autonomous world, why can't you just fully interact with the meeting? I mean, all of us on this meeting right now could be in a vehicle doing this if we're not driving the vehicle, right? So that's something that's going to be coming. And another one is, we mentioned before about BMW's gesture control. While as in the current landscape, it hasn't really taken off fully, and BMW is actually going to pull it out of some of the future vehicles. But it was such an important test to have technology like that, because if you think about in an autonomous world, when the steering wheel isn't right in front of you and the screens are larger and a little bit set further back, it's going to be harder to have either the tactile controls or to have, touch screens, because those controls will be further back to give you more space. When they are, gesture controls can really be important in the autonomous world. So a lot of great technologies that can, with simple tweaks, can really work in the new autonomous world.
Yeah. Chip, anything to add?
Yeah, I think that we talked a little bit about that immersion versus distraction point that Cap's talking effectively about. And I think the challenging part gets to be the transitions in and out of those states. So in a non-autonomous world, you're always paying attention, things are fine. In a future fully level 5 state, when you never have to pay any attention, that's fine as well. But when you've got to go back and forth between being cognitively engaged in the driving of the vehicle and safety critical, and I know Jamal has some thoughts around the safety role of the driver in these different autonomous levels. But as you need to shift in and out of those, the HMI is very important in learning how to, or the OEMs in the vehicle have to know how to appropriately get your attention out of the immersive experience you're in, whether it be a Teams meeting or a game, and into the driving environment again, to ensure that you're aware of what's going on and able to take over control. So I think that's an area that's really quite challenging, is understanding how to do that effectively.
So task switching, right? We talk about people thinking they can multitask, which isn't really true. They simply task switch rapidly. So figuring that out. Jamal, any comments on this topic?
Yeah, what Chip is talking about is situational awareness, right? How are you shifting them in and out of the situational awareness they need when there are these transitions and handbacks or switching back to autonomy, so forth. As you're in the lower levels of autonomy, there are lots of operational design domains, and you're moving in and out of those operational design domains, and this can encompass everything from different types of roads to different types of weather conditions, snow or heavy rain or fog, or certain times of day. If you're, like Tesla, and only using cameras and vision, and you've got sort of high glare, like a sunrise and sunset, and the sensors are sort of temporarily blind. There's all kinds of situations where these transitions are a critical part when the operator is safety critical or safety relevant to these situations. And so, to Chip's point, those transitions really matter. And part of HMI design is how quickly can you enable a driver or someone who's in control to become situationally aware in the time frame that you need them to take back over control and have the context and awareness that they need to be competent. And that is all part of the safety critical, safety relevant sort of interactions that I'm talking about here. And as in that autonomy level keeps ramping up, that becomes less and less. And then you can pivot to the other kinds of things like voice activation and other kinds of experiences that the car is engaging. I've even seen seats that pivot and rotate so that you're no longer even like facing out the car, right? Because the idea there being is like there's a lot more lead time to then, if there is an unusual example where you need to take over, right? And so how do we then leverage that time that's been freed up? And how do we then have that larger story arc? What are all the things that change? Are you taking meetings on your commute? All those kinds of things that we've been talking about. And I think we are just at the beginning of OEMs starting to explore what are all these different kinds of use cases as their autonomy keeps improving and getting better and they're getting certified up the levels.
Yeah, no, great. Super segue. Thank you. I'm going to ask Chip you this next question, which is really, and I'm going to combine it with an audience question, believe it or not, which is really around what do the OEMs need to think about as they get ready for autonomous, right? What are the kinds of areas that are different? And the audience question is from Jasmine Cortez, who talks about various API integrations that are now required to make features happen, route planning suggestions and things like that. You and I operate, of course, Chip, in the mobility world where we see the ecosystem, we like to say, get bigger and bigger and bigger, lots of players, lots of different groups. So what are the things that OEMs have to think about as they move to autonomous? And then how do they deal with all these providers and suppliers and bringing all that together? The integration word we like to use, right? How do they think about that? Go ahead.
Yeah, there's two major themes I'm pulling from that I think are critical for automakers to think about. One is, yeah, that integration of information and experiences from the entire ecosystem. So, in Jasmine's question, she talks about, routing decisions, things come out. At the end of the day, and this ties a little bit back to a comment earlier about owning the branded experience in the vehicle. At the end of the day, the automaker is sort of the buck stops here party for being responsible for that in-vehicle HMI experience. So you might be getting pieces from not only Apple and Google, but from from Waze or here, other navigation companies, or various third parties, or your infotainment, streaming, entertainment, or even gaming, as Jasmine talks about. There's all of these information streams and all of these control streams available. But at the end of the day, the OEM needs to tie these together in a coherent package and enable the customer in the vehicle to appropriately interact at the right time with the right streams and the right information. So there's a lot of integration work to come up with, as Jamal referred to, the holistic experience in the vehicle. It can't be completely fragmented. I interact with my streaming audio in one way, but with my radio in a completely different way, right? You've got to have a coherent, holistic experience that goes across all of your providers.
Yeah.
The other major theme there is, again, something that Jamal referred to earlier, which is a difference between infotainment, which gets a lot of the attention, right? Because that's cool, that's sexy, that's new stuff, that's exciting. People want to be able to consume media and they want to be able to even interact with games, et cetera, in the vehicle. But that's a domain here. The vehicle control is really the core of the automaker's responsibility, is safely transporting you from one place to another. And the HMI requirements there are significantly different than how do I best get Netflix in front of a backseat passenger who wants to binge their latest series. It's very different to think about how do I ensure that in a vehicle with varying autonomous capabilities, the customer is completely aware of the environment in which they're in and how the vehicle is going to navigate within that environment. So, are we going to get to the point where there's voice controls for how aggressively the AI drives, right? You're going to attack, oh, I'm in a hurry, get me to the airport as quick as you can, versus, hey, why don't we relax a little bit? It's a nice Sunday drive and I don't want to be stressed out. That's a really, really different kind of a challenge than figuring out how to get the latest episode of Bridgerton into your car.
Yeah.
So, those are, and typically a lot of different groups within the OEM that are handling those as well. So figuring out how to make sure that everybody is involved in the right way can be challenging.
Yeah, no, that's great. And Jamal, you're of course in the thick of all that, right? You're in the thick of putting all these kinds of things together and dealing with all these different providers and car companies, et cetera. Ultimately, how do you feel it's going? How are automakers listening, changing, acting differently, exploring? How are they integrating, right? Because people have to integrate these different things because they can't do it all themselves. automakers, certainly.
Mm.
What do you run
I think
into in the day-to-day work here that you're doing?
I think that is something they recognize obviously as a challenge because of the long tail of producing these different
Yeah,
features into the vehicles themselves, right? Making sure that you have a stable product. And so the timelines tend to be very long. That said, they all have sort of labs and other things where they're experimenting with all of these kinds of technologies that we're talking about and how to best integrate them into the car. And I think to Chip's point and what I've been talking about, there's sort of a pretty clear bifurcation. You see a lot of experimentation on the infotainment, the things that are not safety critical in the car. And that usually feeds into how, when you start thinking about those interactions on the safety critical side, are there learnings that you can take from those kinds of interactions? The time that people are context switching, those kinds of things that you can use to be helpful on the side that is safety critical and relevant. But generally speaking, you're looking at very long timelines when I think about the difference between having done some app development, where you can turn something around in a couple of weeks in a sprint cycle. OEMs are a little bit longer timeline, usually more
yeah,
like years than
yeah,
weeks. But
yeah,
there's a lot of that going on, and you see a lot of various experimentation within those groups, trying to dial in and figure out what are the right types of narrative and arc across all of the different experiences and variations. And you generally get a pretty complex matrix there, but that's part of, I think, what's so interesting about how you see things like the gestures that BMW are doing and what they're going with, or what Mercedes are doing. Like, there's a lot of really interesting experimentation going on. I'm sort of curious to see if there's a standardization that comes here in the next like 5 to 10 years across a lot of these things, and where they're going to land. Um, and I think about this just because going really far back, HMI used to traditionally be like the steering wheel and the feel of like the shifter and the pedals and the clutch and all of those things, right? And how the suspension arms work and how that feedback is in the steering wheel. Well, going all the way back, Cadillac invented like the first standardization of a steering wheel and an accelerator pedal and a brake pedal and a shift knob, right, to change gears. Like, before that, it was all over the place, right? And they came up with that first standardization. I think it's like 1914, if memory serves me. And so there are generally these divergence, like as these things emerge, you'll get a lot of people experimenting and there'll be cool ideas. And what happens, everybody will cherry pick and sort of consolidate on something that works.
yeah.
And I think we're sort of in an expansion phase right now
Just to
because of the evolution of those things.
No, agreed, agreed. And it's an example. When I was Jaguar Cars many years ago, we were benchmarking the 7 Series BMW, of course, and they had the haptic controller, you may remember. And they had a feature which was a glove box stored 3M Post-it note pad that said, here's how to drive the car, so that when you went to the restaurant for the valet, you could pull off the Post-it note, put it on the steering wheel, and the valet would be able to figure out how to use the haptic controller. They actually had to implement that because of customer issues.
Yeah,
So,
that convergence is really interesting stuff because, as you say, but before that, if anybody's ever seen how an old Model T actually works, like your average driver today would be completely lost. Like,
yes.
this spark advance, what in the world? And like, the throttle's over here, and so it's it's there has been that significant convergence in the physical operation of the vehicle, and yeah, I think it's a great point to be watching how that convergence will happen in the digital world for interfacing
Yep.
different
Yep.
systems.
And any comments about kind of how automakers have to deal with this transition to autonomous driving and all the HMI that goes with it?
Yeah, I just want to touch on something that Chip said earlier. I mean, really, the one of the major conflicts is that there's things that are important for the automaker. Again, touching what Jamal used, safety critical, right? There's a lot of things that are both safety critical, but also just heavily regulated, especially as we move into autonomous. That the automaker needs to always be, keeping forefront because lives are at risk. Plus, also, if you have an investigation because you did something wrong, it's a massive regulatory issue for an automaker. But there's a big disconnect between that and what a consumer might prioritize, right? A consumer may not understand the importance for all of those things, and they're prioritizing the things like the Netflix and the newest season of Bridgerton and what they can get what they can do to entertain themselves in the vehicle, right? So there's always going to be that conflict that an automaker is going to face, and they're going to have to find a way to, yes, satisfy what the consumer wants, but never at the expense of the things that are important for safety and important for keeping them as a going concern as a company.
Yep, got it.
Yeah, I'd
And
like to just, if I could just, one other
sure.
thing that I haven't really heard us bring up that I think is going to be an interesting challenge for automakers as well. And perhaps we haven't come up with it because we're all in a certain strata here, but generational differences in level of comfort interacting with
Mm,
different types of systems, I think are going to be something that OEMs are going to have to deal with. So the way I would expect my parents to interact with a vehicle versus the way I would expect my kids to interact with a vehicle is likely to be significantly different. And so having a one size fits all mindset around how the HMI is going to operate is probably not going to go very well because different people will have very different ideas about what is most comfortable for them to interact with a vehicle. Generational is a big one, but I think you'll see cultural differences as well between different countries and different regions who also have different kinds of expectations for the vehicle HMI.
yeah.
And I
So
will add to that, if I
good.
will.
Yeah.
The other fixture there is whether you have a first-time user versus like a power user versus someone who's an active user. Their engagement and the way they engage with all of these interfaces changes over time as well. And that's another consideration amongst what you mentioned. And
No,
do
it's
we do a lot of testing on all the things you just mentioned? Yes, it is a very complex matrix, but that's part of the fun of what we do and why we do this.
right, right. And let's imagine the robo-taxi where Chip's parents, he and his wife and his kids are all in the same autonomous vehicle that doesn't have a driver. How do you cater to all these different groups kind of at the same time, right? A really interesting question. Any comments, Chip?
Yeah, and I think it ties in a little bit. We got a question from Daniel Schaefer and the attendees here about basically it comes down to offerings to different seats in the vehicle, right? So the expectation again that one size fits all is not a great expectation. So the ability to figure out how to individualize the experience, based on the person who's in each seat, is going to become important. The technology is there and it's getting there to be able to have a unique environment by seat based on what the person in that seat wants and needs. Not only their role in the vehicle, driver, passenger, etc., but by just their individual preferences. This person wants to be playing video games on their Steam Deck. Great. This person wants to be watching the scenery and understanding what they're passing. And, this person here, is taking a meeting on Zoom and listening to industry experts like us talk about wonderful things like HMI and autonomous vehicles. So that ability to customize and personalize is going to be really important.
So this is really interesting to think about. We had a question from the audience. Florence Gay asks about kind of integrations for consumers in their experience. There's lots of different streams of connectivity and interaction they have to deal with now, and sometimes they feel like guinea pigs, perhaps, for the automakers. But it also leads to the question I had already thought about, which is how does automakers and the designers and developers, how do they get feedback from customers about what they need, what they want? There's that old idea of Steve Jobs saying people don't really know what they want until you give it to them, and that kind of thing. And then there's the way I was trained, which is go research it to death until you get the right answer. And I'm just wondering, Jamal, in your world, how you get that information, right? Because you can just throw stuff out there and the customers will have a good experience or not, and you'll learn that. But that's really not, that's like the really original days of automotive where they built the car and then they sent it to the dealer and he just fixed the rest of it before they sold it.
Yeah.
Right. So how do you get that today, that customer feedback?
Well, I think the pre-production side of things is very similar to what you said. There's a lot of vetting of ideas and validating of them. But as we've been talking about, there's an opportunity post to collect data because it's so software heavy. And so you can sort of be feeding back some of those things and with software updates, evolve your software. And I assume I haven't seen a lot of this yet, but to our Chip's point previously, being able to customize potentially that software to unique users in the vehicle and what their preferences are, and maybe tuning those features is sort of the next level, being able to capture and keep iterating based on that data that you're capturing from your interactions and experience in the vehicle and with the
Right.
software. Hmm?
Great. Super. And then let's talk about, I mentioned robo taxis. Let's just talk about kind of, they're out there, right? They're out in the world. I see Waymos now all the time. I see all kinds of different vehicles, Zoox vehicles, in different cities. Atlanta, where I live, just got some new types of vehicles. For example, out as a city, millions of miles now. How is that affecting, the design and how cars are kind of being organized now that people are getting used to getting in autonomous vehicles, right? Anybody have an answer? Cap, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, one of the things to consider, that again, touching on something that Chip said earlier, where the buck stops at the automaker, right? But that's not where it starts, right? A lot of times, if you ask an average person off the street, not the folks on this call who understand the auto industry and how it's configured, but you ask the average person on the street, they might tell you their experience with a Waymo. They probably don't remember that it was a Jaguar I-Pace, right? They don't say, hey,
Mhm.
this Jaguar I-Pace was comfortable to sit in and had some cool features. Let's say this Waymo was very comfortable and had cool features, right? So their interaction is going to be with that autonomous driving robo-taxi service, and everything's branded that way. But it's up to Jaguar, for example, in this particular example, to have the right technological integration to have the right atmosphere or whatever features that user wants, right? So that's going to remain an important challenge. But frankly, it's going to help in some ways, right? Because it's just so much data that's being collected out there because of all these Waymos out on the road. For example, again, going back to that Jaguar example, could Jaguar have collected all that data on their own? Probably not, right? But with that partnership with Waymo, there's a lot of feedback that they could get through their Waymo partner, and they could evolve future vehicles to meet the needs of those consumers and how they're now using it versus how maybe the consumers were intended to be using it when the Jaguar I-Pace was designed.
Right.
Yeah.
Jamal, or Chip, go ahead.
Oh,
Jamal, after you.
I'm happy to, sure. So the thing that comes to mind for me, and having worked on robotaxis, is adoption. There's things that are outside of the domain about perception. And so if you think about things like, I don't know, VHS versus Betamax, you can have a superior standard and it not take off. Just because you're doing something well and effective doesn't mean that it's being adopted by the culture and the society. And I see robo-taxis really helping to bridge that gap. People can get in with very low effort and see the competence of these vehicles and as they evolve. And so their relationship with autonomy, the capabilities, capacity is very much. One of the things that was very identifiable across robo-taxis as an industry is that when people first get in for the first time, you can see that they're very focused on how capable is the vehicle. And once they become comfortable that the vehicle is capable, they stop looking at those screens that show that capability and they're on and pivoting to other things, music, whatever else, but they are not concerned any longer about the car, right, and its capabilities, unless something again happens that makes them become aware of that. That sort of adoption and mindset and synthesizing of the capabilities of the vehicle is very important, I think, for the industry as a whole, because it sets up a stage where people are more accepting and wanting to investigate, can they purchase these things for themselves? Do they want this in their own vehicles? And sort of seeding the ground of adoption across the industry.
Right. Great. Chip?
Yeah, and I was just going to tie this robo-taxi concept back into Florence's question, right? About managing all the different inputs from the different suppliers. Somebody's going to figure it out because somebody has to figure it out. And the risk for automakers is that it's not them that figures it out, right? So in the Waymo example, that is an issue for Jaguar, that those are going to be remembered as Waymos and not as Jaguars, right? And it's similar to what we talked about earlier with CarPlay and Android Auto. There are lots of folks whose primary selection criteria is does it have CarPlay or doesn't have Android Auto, as opposed to does it have 350 horsepower or can it pull at 1G on a skid pad or whatever, right? There is a significant risk for the automakers of loss of branding if it is not the automakers who figure out how to provide the right HMI end experience. If they don't get it right, somebody else will, and that entity is going to be the one that customers remember and that they buy for. And that is something the automakers are going to have to deal with.
Yeah, yeah, couldn't agree more. And we just have a couple more minutes, but I want to get to Matt Anderson's question about software-defined vehicle. We haven't mentioned that, SDV, how SDV relates to voice or other control mechanisms. Any comments about kind of the work and the progress that we see in the software-defined vehicle landscape and how that might affect HMI and autonomous? Chip, you want to address that?
Sure, I'll start with this because it ties back into, we talked about OTA before, and SDV is just the OTA writ large, right? So the vehicle itself is defined by its software load, and OTA enables that. So as we develop more capabilities, as more players come into the ecosystem and figure out how to do things, as OEMs become more sophisticated, the fact that the foundation is going to be the SDV is going to allow the evolution of the not only the capabilities of the vehicle, but of the HMI. You specifically mentioned voice. Well, as LLMs continue to very rapidly expand their capabilities, those capabilities will then be able to be fed back into the vehicle to make them more capable of interacting in natural and intuitive ways via voice with the folks in the car.
Yeah, got it. Jamal, any comments on software-defined vehicle?
Yeah, this one, I think maybe a little out of my purview. I tend to think more about like the actual experiences in the vehicle, not so much about how we're enabling them or what technologies we're using. I want to, I'm using all the tools that are available to me, generally speaking. I think just to pick up on Chip's point, like there are a lot of things beyond voice and heads-up displays and driver monitoring and all of those things that um, I'm seeing being integrated. There's a lot of sort of experimentation in AR and VR going on there as well, and augmentation. I think, to Chip's point, it's going to take people really figuring out and sort of gravitating towards very unique experiences and interactions that are very case specific across that ecosystem. And those things are what's going to really generate and drive the bigger adoption among OEMs once people like figure out a really tangible use case and can expand upon that. And I feel like a lot of people are still struggling to sort of nail those things down without giving anything away. Um, and we'll see as these things evolve. I think there's also sort of, to Chip's point, there's a nexus. A lot of these technologies are emergent, and so they may not be mature enough that they're cost effective enough to get into a vehicle just quite yet. They may be a couple years away, and so there's sort of a tug and a pull between like, how can we integrate these things, but how can we make sure that we're doing it at a production level cost benchmark? And so those things tend to sort of be a little bit limiting. And so I think you'll see a lot more of experimentation before you see those things and those use cases come in.
Super.
That's how
Well,
I see where the ground meets my sort of real world tangible.
yeah, got it.
Yep.
Super. Thank you. We're about a minute over time, so we're going to have to end it here. Really appreciate it. Really interesting discussion. Really appreciate our panelists joining, Jamal, Cap, and Chip. Hope everybody has a great afternoon. We will send the recording out for this meeting to everybody that registered, as mentioned. And thanks very much. Have a great rest of your week and a good holiday.
All right.
Take care.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.